fire flickers in the depths of a dark forest. A group of women dance around the pyre, their hands raised above their heads, and a deep, rhythmic chanting permeates the clearing. One of the women, her eyes softly glowing, falls to the ground and turns to the stars. She perceives the world rushing past her, tunneling through the earth to somewhere far away and deep below. In the darkness there is a soft glow, revealing an emerald lake full of strange, shimmering fish. On the far side of the lake sits an island, and she can just make out the stark towers and sweeping black walls of an ancient castle. She can hear the tolling of bells and a gentle weeping. Something moves behind the walls of the castle, vast and ancient, turning its single black eye upon the young witch. Suddenly the ground rushes away and she is returned to the grove. The chanting has stopped. Her sisters are nowhere to be seen. As she rises to her feet, she looks around the clearing. She does not see the man clad in black, an ebon seal branded upon his face. He steps from the trees behind her and tackles her to the ground, before binding her hands and feet, dragging her back through the forest to a vast, spired church. Once again, the night is filled with the tolling of bells. Hello, I'm Matthew and welcome to Genesis 101, the show where I help you build worlds that will excite and engage your audiences. To do this, I'm going to present ideas and tips for world building and apply those techniques to build the setting before your very eyes. Before we begin, the series assumes that you're world building for a tabletop RPG, but the techniques and ideas I'm going to be sharing with you guys today should work well for any form of media, from television to games design. So, fantasy horror world building. Let's get to it. Part 1. And the walls shall have eyes. Fantasy horror is a genre that combines elements of high fantasy, like The Lord of the Rings, the Arthurian myth, or Dungeons & Dragons Forgotten Realms, with elements of horror. It's worth pointing out here at the beginning that there are many styles of horror, and these in turn create different styles of fantasy horror. Take, for example, Series 1 and 2 of Netflix's Castlevania. This certainly contains elements of high fantasy, while combining them with elements of gothic horror. Vast, terrifying castles, a villain motivated by a twisted misunderstanding of human emotion, and sublime and terrifying visuals. We can call Castlevania, then, a gothic fantasy horror. Meanwhile, the new Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition module, Rime of the Frost Maiden, is being marketed as fantasy survival horror. Survival horror typically focuses on limited healing, limited supplies, and pushing characters to see what they will do in order to survive. The term was first coined to describe the 1996 game Resident Evil, and if you've played one of the good Resident Evil games, it should give you a good idea of what survival horror can mean. Fantasy fans have always had a connection to this last one, cosmic horror. Typically attributed to H.P. Lovecraft, though in actuality we can see some of the themes presented in earlier works, such as the King in Yellow short stories by Robert W. Chambers. Cosmic horror is horror derived from the meaninglessness of existence, the presence of entities that regard humans as we regard ants, if, indeed, they regard us at all. Cosmic horror tends to rely heavily on unsettling implications, leading to a confrontation with proof of these creatures. Fantasy cosmic horror has been a part of the style from the very beginning. For an example, see The Doom That Came to Sarnath, which is a tale of prophecy and magic, and also my favourite Lovecraft story. Check it out if you get the chance, I think it's really neat. These will be the building blocks of your world. Choosing a horror style might help you select other important things about your setting as well, such as its technological era. Gothic horror is often associated with the Victorian era, so if you decide to build your setting around that, it might have gas lamps and early firearms. Equally, you may try to stay away from that, and there's absolutely no reason not to. Dracula was written in 1897, but The Monk, an earlier Gothic novel, was released 100 years prior in the late 1700s. The Gothic style is associated with an aesthetic of decaying splendour, which you could create in any time period. There are other styles beside the three mentioned above. Folk horror, which focuses on rural environments and themes of the power of nature, isolation and religion, for which The Witcher could be considered an excellent example. There is natural horror, which focuses on nature running amok and the danger posed by the wild, untamed earth. For example of these, see Jaws, Piranha, the cinematic masterpiece Sharknado. And finally, sci-fi horror, which focuses on themes of playing God, the dangers of science, and unchecked technological progress. Frankenstein is often considered an early example of sci-fi horror. This list isn't exhaustive, so if none of these appeal to you, then have a look around, see what you like, and work that into your style. Also, don't be afraid of combining styles. The best ideas often come from improving on or combining old ideas. If you want to try combining, for example, Gothic horror with noir mystery and fantasy, that's totally cool and might make for a really interesting setting. It's also worth considering what kind of fantasy you want to use in your setting. You have high fantasy, with various humanoid species running around and magic being commonplace and very powerful, or low fantasy, with the only species being humans and magic being rare and less powerful, or indeed anything between the two. Ultimately, this is a decision that you will have to make, but for fantasy horror in particular, I would tend to recommend something towards the low fantasy end of the spectrum, particularly if your RPG of choice has dark vision or any similar feature associated with other races. On to the setting we are building then. This setting is called Caremir, and I'm feeling a gothic, low fantasy, cosmic horror style. Technologically, it sits in the late medieval era, so it's pre-firearms, and with it being cosmic horror fantasy, the current civilizations are not the first, so the world is dotted with vast ruins that were built by long since dead civilizations and creatures. It is a world with only humans, but the supernatural is not too uncommon, and this includes various other hominid creatures such as vampires, werewolves, ghosts, that kind of thing. Now we have the style dealt with, we need to turn to the source of the horror. We need to turn to entities. Part 2. Wolves Without Teeth. All horror stories are monster stories. Monsters can take many different shapes, they may be human, they may even be an institution or a force of nature, but all are monsters nonetheless. In order to build a horror setting, as opposed to telling a horror story within a setting, you need a world defined by its monsters. For an example of this, consider Curse of STRAHD, a D&D 5th edition module. The setting of Curse of STRAHD, the Kingdom of Barovia, is defined quite literally by Strahd von Zarovich, the vampiric ruler of the land. The sun does not shine in Barovia owing to dark storm clouds and a thick, rolling fog, and the land is patrolled by werewolves, witches, and the undead, many loyal to the vampire lord. He is the entity that defines the setting. Within the lore, he is somewhat beholden to the dark powers, but they only briefly factor into the plot, and it is Strahd that players will remember. Now, you don't have to be quite so obvious about what it is you're doing. A land without sun is pretty on the nose, and that kind of oppressive darkness can negatively affect the horror element of any medium. If the audience are always on guard, then it can reduce the dread that they feel when they are actually approaching something horrifying. On the flip side, it certainly can create a feeling of hopelessness or despair, as in Curse of Strahd or Dark Souls 3. This is more a stylistic choice than one with a correct answer, and there are plenty of interesting decisions that could be made here. Midsummer, for example, is set in northern Scandinavia in the summer. As such, the darkest it gets is dusk, an unusual but very interesting choice for horror fiction. Speaking of Midsummer, it's a good example of institutions as monsters. In Midsummer, the setting is dominated by a rural cult that is blindly loyal to its leaders and traditions, and thus willing to do and defend doing horrible things in the pursuit of their goals. Now, the institution as monster is almost always a cult, but there is no reason it has to be. A modern fantasy horror could certainly use a government or corporation as the monster. Indeed, the monsters in the Purge franchise are not really the individuals going out killing people, but the new founding fathers, who permit them to do so in pursuit of socio-economic equilibrium. In Resident Evil, the real monsters are not the zombies or even the scientists who show up in some of the games as bad guys. The monster of the setting is the Umbrella Corporation, who released a deadly virus to test a biological weapon. These monsters define their settings. If you decide to go with an institution as monster, you will need to flesh out their beliefs. That will involve deciding what their philosophy entails and what their designs are for the world. For the cult in Midsummer, it is to ensure bountiful crops for their people, and to honour their traditions. In The Purge, the objective of the new founding fathers is to prevent the collapse predicted by philosopher Thomas Malthus by reducing the population and to prevent the poor rising up and killing the rich. And for the Umbrella Corporation in Resident Evil, it's maximising profit for their shareholders. Not unlike real-world corporations. I made myself sad. Anyway, deciding on the beliefs of these villains will help you understand their motives, and thus, how they are likely to behave. Now obviously, you also have your more classical monsters, a world with a necromantic plague turning people into zombies, or dominated by giant monsters that drive you mad if you look at them, as in Bird Box, but there is no reason different types of monsters cannot intersect. A totalitarian government using emergency powers to imprison and experiment on undesirables in order to prevent the spreading of a necromantic plague is a world defined by the conflict between two monsters. And a world where vast portions of the outdoors are governed by weird cults worshipping these giant horrifying monsters is a world defined by the collaboration between the two. So what about Caremir? What monsters are we going to have, and how do they inform each other? Firstly, from the cosmic horror element, we have monsters that used to live in the material world, but now live in the realm of dreams. These creatures are known as the Faded Ones, and each is completely unique, not part of any pattern or species. Previous civilizations worshipped them as the Radiant Ones, and when you dream, their palaces are always visible but never quite within reach. The Faded Ones created humans as a servant race and gave some of them their blood. These people and their descendants are able to become mages. Female mages are much more common and can reach greater heights of power than male mages. Other mystical creatures can emerge from these bloodlines as well, seemingly at random, but likely as a result of two bloodlines from different Faded Ones interacting. Ingesting or being injected with the blood of these creatures can spread their abilities. For a large part of Caremir's history, the Faded Ones were worshipped as gods, and the world was dominated by sorcerer queens. However, after one of the queens became mad on the northeastern continent of Varane, a revolt overthrew the government and established a theocratic dictatorship, the Church of the Black Seal. The Church is a kind of anti-religion, dedicated to the destruction of all that remains of the Faded Ones on Caremir. They spread like wildfire all across the continent, riding a wave of anti-nobility sentiment and establishing a vast empire. The Church burn any suspected witches and use their military power to maintain near-total control of the women within their territories. They are easily recognisable by the black brand they use on their face. This prevents them from dreaming, which in turn prevents the Faded Ones manipulating them while they sleep. So the setting is defined by this conflict between the Church and the Faded Ones, with witches, members of other faiths, magical creatures, and a lot of innocent women caught in the crossfire. This is the source of the horror in the setting and creates a sense of a world in decline, which props up the Gothic style. It also draws attention to the key themes in this setting, common to both Gothic and cosmic horror: blood and ancestry. We now have the very basics of the world laid out, but there is one more core feature of horror fantasy that is really important, more so than in any other genre of fantasy, and particularly if you're world building for an RPG. We need to talk about the Afterlife. Part 3. The Circle's End. So, I debated whether I should include this here or whether I should put it in a video about religion in fantasy horror, which is definitely coming down the line. It's already in the works. but inconsistency in the portrayal of the afterlife is something that I find absolutely infuriating, especially in horror. That's not to say you can't have multiple afterlives, but I think it's more effective if you have a clear set of rules, and baking those rules into the heart of the world is probably a more effective strategy in order to produce consistency. If you disagree and think that inconsistency in afterlives isn't that big a deal, then that's totally fine and a-okay, but you are definitely wrong and you should be ashamed of yourself. So what makes the afterlife so important to fantasy horror? The truest, most universal fear is often said to be the fear of the unknown. We have our good friend Mr. Lovecraft to thank for that. But what Lovecraft didn't understand is that the fear of the unknown is just an expression of the fear of death. Some psychologists and sociologists have even argued that all of human culture is an attempt to help people hide from that fear. Most notably Ernest Becker, who wrote The Denial of Death, for which he was awarded a posthumous Pulitzer Prize, and which I highly recommend. It uses some slightly outdated language when talking about sexuality, but it is incredible and can totally change the way that you understand the world, especially if you're anything like me and have major death anxiety. So death and the threat of death is an excellent way to promote a sense of dread, but knowledge of an afterlife can throw a spanner in the works, because if there is an afterlife, you don't really die. A horror fantasy setting has to deal with the fact that the scariness of a big monster is reduced if death means you go to an eternal paradise, and thus you need to construct an afterlife that can support the horror of the setting. There are numerous approaches of note here. I'm going to start with my favourite portrayal of the afterlife in any piece of media. I really like the way it is handled in American Horror Story Season 3, Coven. Which, incidentally, I would describe as modern fantasy horror. Many characters die throughout Coven, and we occasionally get to see a glimpse of the afterlife, but all of the characters we see wind up in hell, and the gatekeeper of hell, a Loa, which is a kind of deific spirit in Haitian voodoo, named Papa Legba, at one point says,
"No one gets away with sin. Eventually, everybody pays. Everybody suffers."
The implication there being that the only afterlife is hell. Now this is obviously contradicted by later series of the show, which is really annoying, but it is an interesting option. Another example of what we will call the everybody suffers approach to afterlife is Stephen King's Revival, which is a cosmic horror version of the same trope. Most cosmic horror stays away from the afterlife, as it's pretty hard to portray existence as meaningless if you have an immortal, immutable soul, but Stephen King manages to create an utterly hopeless vision of the afterlife, where giant ant people, I know, it sounds ridiculous, but I promise it's really good, guide a single file line of human souls through a vast dark desert towards their queen for reasons unknown. Now, obviously, Everybody Suffers is a pretty dark take on life after death, and maybe you want something a bit different. You can take a more traditional fantasy approach to afterlife, with different places for souls to go to. However, it is worth bearing in mind that the guarantee of some eternal reward for good behaviour can remove the sting from death, so it may be worth introducing some degree of risk. In D&D canon, demons regularly snatch the souls of the dead, even those destined for other planes, and having a mechanism like that in place can still create an element of fear, though in general I would say that this style is less good at supporting horror than the other options presented here. The final options are reincarnation or a lack of afterlife. Now I group them together here because they are, in consequence, the same thing. Under most versions of reincarnation you die, lose all your memories, get a different body, adopt different behaviours and mannerisms, and have no traceable continuity with your previous self except your soul. Reincarnation then is just dying with extra steps. A good example of this is in Pillars of Eternity, where the player character becomes aware of their previous lives, and it changes the way they interact with the world, making them able to see the past lives of others, and informing their decisions throughout much of the rest of the game. Other people, however, are unaware of their previous lives, and to them, those other lives are just dead. The no afterlife approach is interesting because it makes characters fear death the same way we do. Death is a void that characters cannot comprehend or approach. Now, this does not necessarily mean there is no soul, but you need to work out what to do with the soul if you elect not to have an afterlife. There are various options. In the Dark Souls games, for example, souls are inanimate and are fuel for the fire that lights the world, making them more like a resource than something in which the minds of the dead live on. In some animistic traditions, the spirits return to the earth, and is once again part of nature. Again, you can use a hybrid system, a system with no afterlife unless a deity intercedes on your behalf, a system with only hell but a religious method to annihilate your soul before death, or a system with several sinister afterlives, like the Plains of Oblivion from the Elder Scrolls franchise. There are plenty of options available, and many interesting systems come from combination and improvement. Just be sure you know what the rules are for your setting. Back to Caremir. What afterlife system am I going to use there, and why? So in Caremir, souls come from the Sea of Phantoms, a location underneath the realm of dreams that looks like a vast teal lake. When a fetus is developing and it dreams in the womb, its body is filled with a soul, which spreads to fill its form. When a person dies, their soul returns to the Sea of Phantoms, losing its shape like a raindrop in a river. This can only be prevented by the direct intervention of the Faded Ones, but with their power long since having reached its zenith, they rarely, if ever, interfere in this day and age, and most people simply pass into the Sea of Phantoms forgotten. If a person does not realise they have died or has a particularly strong will, then they can force their soul to keep its shape and avoid passing into the Sea of Phantoms, becoming a ghost. There are also various ways mages can achieve this, the most notable being to create a small doll in their image and trap their soul inside it, this being the process by which people become liches. Okay, and that's that for the basics of fantasy horror world building. I hope you found this first video useful. I assure you it won't be the last. It's been an absolute joy to make. In the next week or so, we're going to look at history and religion in fantasy horror, and I hope to see you there. Until then, this has been Genesis 101. I've been Matthew. Goodbye.